On today's episode, we're talking about how we stepped away from the day to day at our first agency, Barrel, without selling the business. We'll share what it took to make a clean leadership transition, the lessons we learned along the way, and how that move opened the door for us to focus on building Barrel Holdings. Yeah, so let's set the stage. We talked a little bit about this topic in our first episode. When people hear the term exit, they usually think about selling a business. Peter, if you can talk about how our definition of exit was slightly different from that.
Typically with an exit, I think a lot of people, automatically think about like ownership exit where, they are selling their ownership of a business. In our case, yeah, we executed what could be seen as a role exit. The two of us, we were, in our respective day-to-day roles. So I was the CEO and you were the president COO. And we really wanted to kind of find a way to step out of the day-to-day. And so what we engineered was what we call a role exit.
Thinking back, what made us start thinking about stepping out of that day to day? Because, we were in it for 18 years at that point. Why then and why would we exit?
Yeah, for any of you that are curious, in episode 1 where we kind of share our backstory, we go a bit into detail. But the short story is, we had obviously spun out a few other businesses and we started to kind of have this portfolio approach to agencies. And so, then this was all while running Barrel day to day. And so, we thought, hey, we really have an opportunity here to kind of grow the whole entire portfolio, but that means freeing ourselves up from the day to day. And so that's where we started thinking about, hey, is there, we had been successful in setting the other businesses up with their own CEOs. And so we thought, hey, can we do the same thing for Barrel, the company that we have been running for so long? And that's when we started to, see if there was a path.
So let's go a little bit into the nitty gritty about the transition. So yeah, if you can share, who we identified as a person who could take over as CEO, and then, why did we think that he'd be a good fit?
So Lucas Ballasy is the CEO of Barrel now. So the origin story of that is he started as a designer at Barrel. So, this was back in 2013. He applied to be a designer. He started as a freelance designer, became full-time. And then, right away, we kind of knew we had someone special. Just, some of the qualities he brought to the table were, really impressive. Just super proactive guy, low ego, but also just hungry for more responsibilities. And, I think we've always, for people like that, we're always willing to continue to give them the challenges, and kind of give them what they can handle, or maybe more than what they can handle to, just continue to grow within the organization. And Lucas did exactly that. He could continue to grow, soon became like senior designer, associate creative director, and then eventually kind of joined our executive leadership team. And so, through that progression, we just kind of got to see, what really made Lucas tick, and then that, his values aligned really well with ours. And so, I think when it came time for us to look for a CEO candidate, it was a pretty easy choice in that, hey, we think Lucas is the right person. If he's up for it, no, we should definitely invest in making him the CEO.
It was definitely a multi-year experience. You mapped out how his role within the company and responsibilities increased. Even at that point, there's still gaps in what he needed to take on. Yeah, if you could talk a little bit about like how we prepared him for like the role of the CEO and any steps that we took to get him ready for that.
Yeah. I mean, part of the journey of getting Lucas ready for this role was we ourselves needed to do a better job of organizing the business, understanding what was going on. The first thing that we started with was just mapping out, first of all, like what are our responsibilities, between the two of us. And, as founders in a business for, at that point, like more than a decade and a half, there's a lot of little things that we take for granted, little activities, whether it's on the marketing side, HR side, finance side, that we were just doing on autopilot. But then when you kind of take a moment to look at it, you're like, wow, is this stuff really necessary for us to do? Is this something that could be delegated or rethought? We spent a lot of time kind of mapping out all these things. And then I think that gave us a better idea of like, okay, what kind of role is Lucas really stepping into, because we need to make sure it's a clean role where he's set up to succeed. We can't just drop all these random tasks onto his lap. So, that was a big part of it. And then I think through that, we were able to like map out some of the areas that he needed more help than others. Because at this time, he was already like a chief experience officer. So he was kind of in charge of like the client experience, the delivery. Like he was just, just coordinating between all the departments. And so he had a lot on his plate already. So it was more about like, hey, where do we fill in some of these gaps where he might not have had as much experience? Definitely on the finance side, just being able to read a P&L. On the BD side, like, making sure he's more comfortable with just different lead gen activities as well as the sales process and managing the CRM. And, there are a few other buckets as well. Just like, for example, the HR side of things, the policies, PTO, how they work and all that stuff. A couple other big buckets were like, client relationships. Like, did he have a full handle on all the relationships across the company that we had? I know you and I, we had to transition a few relationships over to him as well, which were, took time, but like, was necessary. And then the bigger picture stuff, like strategy, like goal setting, planning for the quarter, the year, those are kind of skills that we had to build with them.
Yeah, I remember this being a really enlightening exercise, personally, to go through and really mapping out all the different like hats that we're wearing. Not all of it went to Lucas. Some of it went to other team members, and we found some other people to help support him, so that he's not just suddenly taking on everything that we're doing, plus what he was doing before. But I think, yeah, that whole mapping exercise is super helpful in general. We talked a little bit about timing. So it happened mid 2024 last year. From what I remember, the timing actually, wasn't the smoothest. Earlier in 2024, Beryl had gone through a challenging period where several of our top clients churned right before the transition. And, that gave us some pause in, whether or not we should move forward. Yeah, anything you can share from that experience, just about the timing and
The headline was like, we top three of our five clients churned all at once, and so, some of these included like longtime clients who had some significant retainers with us. We did have contracts that were kind of that gave us the feeling that this was going to be for the full year, but then I think some of them had like 30, 60, 90-day outs. And so they exercised the outs. And yeah, it was unfortunate for us because we went from like feeling pretty good about 2024 as a growth year to being like, oh my goodness, we have this, hole that's, over seven figures all of a sudden. And now how are we going to make up for that revenue in a short period of time? So, that was weighing on our minds. And then I think at the same time, like, I don't think we were winning deals at a velocity to kind of make that recovery. So yeah, amid all that, it's kind of like, oh, do we like still, yeah, like, should we just hand this off to Lucas and let him deal with it? Is that fair to him? Is that the right kind of move? And so those are some of the things weighing on our minds as we thought about this, because this is a date, the transition handoff date was something we set, a couple of years prior. So as we got closer to the date, we were like, this isn't the most ideal situation for that handoff.
Yeah. Well, we ultimately made the decision, right? July 1st, we went forward with it, and we trusted that Lucas would be able to turn things around somewhat. And our lives changed quite a bit. Personally, what would you say is like the toughest part of letting go after that point of the day-to-day in control?
Yeah, I mean, especially with the circumstances of like you handed off, the business is still in like a little bit of a precarious situation, and I think the toughest thing is just kind of like, look, like we have to really trust that Lucas, we chose him because we trust him that he's going to be the right person to lead this company through the challenges, and we really have to A, be patient because these things don't happen right away, and then B, just be as supportive as possible. And that meant also like, look, like we can't be looking over his shoulder all the time. We can't be questioning his decisions. We really have to give him the space to operate. And I think, in the early days, like, we're still a little bit on edge, probably just because we're like, look, is he making progress? Is he making the right decisions? But I think, thankfully, like we had some other stuff going on as well that kind of allowed us to give him the space. But yeah, definitely, it's hard. This is the business that we had been in for 18 years at that point. And so, yeah, like it's really hard to make that switch, overnight, where you go from like just being in it hour by hour to now it's just a weekly check-in.
Life after the exit was interesting because it's almost like the next day we were off of the website, right? You and I, after he became CEO, everything changed, and then our relationship with him and the company changed as well, where we weren't kind of in the day to day meeting with all these different team members. And to your point, meeting with Lucas on a weekly basis across various things. But it really, opened us up to focus on Barrel Holdings. Yeah, maybe just briefly talk about like what did that shift change in terms of the energy and everything we could bring to Barrel Holdings, and then yeah, what did our relationship with Barrel look like post transition?
I do remember like it felt, and you and I talked about this, like it just felt like starting a new job, honestly, because
Yeah.
first of all, you realize like how many kind of like weekly meetings and like just administrative stuff and like the day-to-day tasks really fill up your calendar, and like just to kind of have to reset that from just being in the thick of it to now. And also, I used to get bombarded with Slack messages from various team members, and you're just like there's all kinds of stuff happening, and so like the action to go from like all these like client related emails, team related emails, everything to just kind of in many ways like just silence. That was a huge shift. In many ways, like there was a little bit of like I guess uncertainty of like, all right, like how am I going to fill the time now, and like what's going to take its place. But there's also like this sense of like, wow, the possibilities and freedom. And I think it was really exciting because we are like, all right, what are we going to do to just really make this holding company successful? The subsequent months, we actually did get thrown into a project, which was, our first acquisition. So that actually took up a lot of our time and energy, which, was exciting and fun, and we learned a lot. But then, even subsequent months after that, I think there was a lot of like discussions. Like we actually had the space and time to just talk strategy, talk vision, and kind of refine that over a long period of time. And that was great. And we continue to do a lot of that now. And it's just it's a different way of like a lot of our things don't have a daily or weekly timeline. It's more, we think more in quarters, more in years. And so I think that has been a shift of we have to be a bit more strategic, a bit more deliberate about some of the decisions that we make.
Awesome. So, if we want to kind of wrap up some of the lessons for the listeners about our process going through this, yeah, if you could share some lessons on what did we learn about succession, building the agency so that it is, exit ready, even if, we didn't sell in the traditional sense. Yeah, any key takeaways from that?
It wasn't like we were strangers to this like idea of like, hey, we're owners in a business and they're CEOs. Because like, we had that with Vaulted Oak, BX Studio, where, we have great leaders of those businesses and we're pretty hands off, and like, they operate wonderfully day to day, and we're able to support them. So, we had that kind of framework and like, the practice there. But I think with Barrel, there was that extra piece of the emotional tie, just because like, you and I, we've been in the business for so long. We had wrapped up our identity so much with that business. And I think in many situations, it would have been very hard to really walk away. But the fact that it was Lucas who, also grew up in the business with us. He had been with us for over a decade, building the business together. And, the level of trust, the stuff that we shared, all the ups and downs we shared along the way, as well as like, like you and I, we went to his wedding, like we all had like kids around the same time. Like, those are all things that kind of build upon just a professional relationship. This is somebody that we care deeply about, and we know, we trust deeply to take over the business. I think that was a huge thing. So, when we think about succession, especially in a business that's like so important to our lives, like just the fact that he was so close, we had that level of trust, the foundation of like, and the history, I think that made it all the more possible. So that's something for folks to think about, is like, yeah, who's that person to take over? And I think the relationship aspect is huge. And like, I think it's very hard to just kind of bring someone from the outside willy-nilly and try to make that happen. In many ways, like if you're thinking about an exit, even if it's somebody that still needs to develop some other skills, like you got to think first and foremost about that relationship.
Yeah, I think there are probably a lot of listeners who are in a similar situation who eventually want to step back from their business. You talk a lot about, relationships and our relationship with Lucas and kind of being on that journey together. Yeah, any other kind of closing thoughts to wrap up our session today on, how relationships really helped us achieve this transition, and any other thoughts for, people moving forward?
When I think about a very important lesson, one is that, yes, relationships are great enablers. But then I think combining that with, just some kind of deliberate, intentional, and proactive planning. Because I think the first maybe 80% of our career was characterized by a great deal of reactiveness. Because, we were just in the thick of it. as problems came up, as different client challenges came up, we're just in this mode of react, react, react. And strong relationships help in that regard too, just because like you're in it together, you're in the trenches together, and you're battling it out together, and just kind of trying to conquer these things as they come up. But I think where the real magic happens is, you combine strong relationships with deliberate planning, doing a visioning together, like thinking about the future together. I remember sitting with Lucas and you, and just like being like, hey, what does Barrel look like in a couple of years when Lucas takes over, and like what are all the steps we have to do to get there? Even just you and I talking about, hey, what's the future of Barrel Holdings, and what does it look like 3 years from now, 10 years from now, and like kind of making those plans together, and then combining that with the relationships that we have, like do that over and over, it compounds in a really powerful way. So I think that that is kind of the essence of like the big takeaway is like, look, just relationships are amazing, work on it, and then pair that with this kind of deliberate kind of intention for the future.
Yeah, Pete, thanks for sharing our experience, and letting people know that there isn't one path to exiting, and there is this secondary path that we took. But yeah, I think that wraps things up for today, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.